the King of Prussia spent his winter in the Saxon capital of Dresden. The Saxon court under King Augustus III was forced to flee to Poland, where he stayed for the rest of the war. As 1757 approached, Frederick knew he would be facing an invasion on four possible fronts: Sweden from the north, Russia from the east, the French from the west, and the Austrians from the southwest. His plan was to quickly force the Austrians out of the war. In April 1757, Frederick now decided to make an attempt to attack the electorate of Bohemia and make the Habsburgs face him sooner rather than later. Frederick wrote to his younger brother Henry that a victory would prove as decisive as Caesar's victory at White Mountain. Frederick reached Prague on May 2, 1757. Schwerin and Bevern crossed the Elbe at Brandwitz on May 4th. On May 5th, Frederick crossed at the Moldau at Slitz, 4 miles from Prague, and joined Schwerin's forces. Field Marshal Keith had been left on the left bank of the Moldau with 32,000 troops. The combined army of Frederick reached about 65,000 troops, whereas the Austrian army, under Maximilian Ulysses Count Browne, comprised 62,000 troops. Frederick's army began to march east from Moldau at 5 a.m. on the morning of the 6th. Seeing the Prussians' army moving across their front, Prince Charles and Field Marshal Browne hurried their troops to open the eastern flank. 40 companies of grenadiers and some 15 regiments of cavalry concentrated in the area of Sturmblumen. They were in time to meet the oncoming attack from Lieutenant General Schwellich and a large force of Prussian cavalry, giving rise to a drawn-out and indecisive struggle between the mounted forces. The rearrangement of the Austrian position was mostly completed, even though the march of the infantry of the former second line and left wing had been seriously delayed by the gorge near Holutz. By 10 p.m., the cuirassiers, a form of Prussian cavalry, of the first line of the Prussian left wing, had bypassed Stubble and deployed south of the village. However, the dragoons, the heavily armed cavalry, forming the second line of the wing, had not yet completed the passage of the flats lying to the east of Unter Pusnitz. Furthermore, the field artillery had not yet managed to pass through the village of Unter Punitz. And at the head of the column of the second line of the infantry left wing was entering the dam on which the road from Unter Punitz to Stubble crossed the flats. Finally, the first line of the infantry left wing was about to negotiate on the low ground around the ponds to the northeast of Stubble and deploy in line. The Prussian military was known for its outstanding cavalry, and they would use them in full force in the Battle of Prague. The first cavalry charge took place on the Austrian right wing. Though outnumbered by Austrian cavalry, the Prussian cuirassiers regiment broke through the first line of the Austrian cavalry, but soon their charge lost momentum when confronted with the mass of Austrian cavalry deployed behind the first line. Outflanked on the right and attacked by Hajduk hussars on their left flank and rear, the Prussian cuirassiers had to retreat. The second charge had more success and forced the Austrian cavalry to retreat further back. Around 11 a.m., in the center of the Prussian lines, Bevern's 7 battalions had taken position slightly to the right and behind the 8 battalions led by Huchimori and Triskau, and 14 battalions had taken position on the left behind Uchimori. They were all advancing in the general direction of New Stronix. Furthermore, Frederick had put 8 battalions of both lines at the disposal of Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick. The Prussian batteries had seriously weakened the Austrian infantry deployed to the southwest of Kish, thus easing the advance of the brigades led by Bevern, Treschow, and Uchimori. Frederick immediately realized that these brigades would not need any additional support to succeed in their attack. Around 1 p.m., Frederick made his final attack on the Austrian forces. Brown maneuvered his right wing to prevent being outflanked, but this opened up other gaps that the Prussians took advantage of, and began attacking the gaps in the Austrian lines. Around 1:30, now threatened on both flanks, the Austrian infantry attacking the Strubel retired in order, defending one hill after another. The Prussians had finally taken Strubel. I don't know how you say that word, sorry. The whole Austrian right wing had become ruined. It hurled itself rapidly behind what redoubts and strong points it had in those parts, and then fled into Prague, hastily closing the doors behind it. Once the infantry corps was routed, the Prussians were able to attack the Austrian infantry divisions, Orburg, Wunik, and Sprecher, as well as 3 cavalry regiments, which formed the first line of the left wing, still standing near the Zagrsburg between Malchitz and Holderors. As the fighting drew closer, the cavalry regiments proceeded towards the Derickdorf and the 2 cuirassier regiments forming the first line of the Liechtenstein Dragoons, the second. They attacked to give enough time for the infantry to retire to Malchitz. Their charge was repulsed with a loss of 17 officers and 400 men. The 3 still uncommitted infantry divisions of the left wing seized the opportunity to take up a position near Wolschen. Their left was now leaning against Zagrsburg, which was occupied by Grenadier light troops. By 3 o'clock, the Austrian army was retreating into Prague. About 40,000 Austrians got crammed into the city. Prince Charles, now recovered, attempted twice to get out of Prague and up the Moldau, but the Prussians positioned on the Nussel-Branach line, preventing them from escaping. They tried by another gate on the other side of the Moldau, but General Keith blocked the way. The Prince Moritz of Dessau arrived late to the battlefield, where he should have been many hours before, and with Keith's right wing, a fresh 1,500 men to fall upon the enemy's rear. Moritz's pontoon bridge would not reach across when he tried. It was the worst mistake Prince Moritz ever made. His arrival could have made the Battle of Rout much more decisive a Prussian victory. Frederick had achieved victory at the Battle of Prague, though not a very decisive one. With around 14,000 Prussian casualties and 13,500 Austrian casualties, including the loss of 4,400 prisoners and 60 guns taken during the battle. The Habsburg army, under Leopold von Daun, moved to meet with Brown's forces. This made the Austrian forces swell to around 55,000 men, whereas Frederick was forced to divert troops from the Bohemian campaign to the home country to defend against Sweden and Russia, forces who looked to invade Prussia from the north and the east. King Frederick's forces now numbered around 34,000. On the 15th of June, 1757, Frederick's scout, Captain Gold, observed from a church steeple and spotted the Austrian camp some 3 miles in the distance from the Prussian camp. Frederick had some difficulty in accepting Gold's report that he was in the presence of the whole Don army and took no action on the 16th. Frederick resolved to continue the march east along Kaiserstrasse, until clear of the Kreisenhoek Hill, and then to wheel around the Austrian right flank before launching his attack. The Prussian advance was headed by the valorous and reliable general, Major General Holsten, with a force of infantry and cavalry dragoons of the D11 Division. Frederick planned to leave the Kaiserstrasse and wheel in to attack the ridge once past the Kreisenhorst. Around midday on the 17th, Frederick soon realized that he was significantly outnumbered and did not have the ability to make an attack on the Habsburg forces. On the 18th of June, the Prussian army reached Kaiserstrasse at Planen and turned east along the highway. Frederick took what he expected to be a high point of vantage in the church spire at Planen and surveyed the hills through his telescope. He could see very little. The army continued on its march until a halt was called while the king attempted a further review of the area from the upper floor of an inn called the Golden Sun. On the morning of the 18th, the Austrian army could be seen disposed of along the ridge south of the Kaiserstrasse from Pierwoski Hill. Daun had placed his cavalry so as to take advantage of the terrain. 2 regiments of infantry under the leadership of General Zieten and Holsten. They were allowed to be followed by several cuirassiers and dragoons. Of course, as you know, these are 2 cavalry brigades, 2 types of cavalry brigades. The striking feature of the ensuing battle was Frederick's apparent change of plan from a flanking attack around the Austrian right flank beyond the village of Kreisenhorst to a frontal attack on the low hills directly from the Kaiserstrasse. This was in contradiction to the instructions he had given his generals in the Golden Sun Inn, and not surprisingly, gave rise to considerable confusion. In the meantime, Frederick directed Prince Moritz, instead of continuing the path of Holsten's troops along the Kaiserstrasse, to turn immediately off the highway and assault the line of hills. Moritz resisted this change of plan, and an argument began between him and Frederick. Eventually, he complied to the Prussian king's directions, and the Prussian infantry began to assault on Kranitz Hill. The attack was in the teeth of a substantial deployment of Austrian artillery positioned on the ridge, which opened fire and inflicted heavy casualties on the advancing Prussian infantry. On the right, Prince Moritz's forces, Major General Manstein's Prussian infantry battalions moved off the Kaiserstrasse and drove the skirmishers out of the Chonitz before moving to assault the Austrian position on Przorki Hill. Under Frederick's supervision, Manstein attacked the hill 3 times between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. While the determined attacks failed to dislodge the Austrian army, they ensured that General Andul did not continue the move of his division to support the Austrian formations under attack on the Kranitz Hill. Late in the afternoon, the Austrian cavalry under Stauffenberg's division received a devastating cavalry charge on its right flank from Major General von Kronick's brigade. At the head of the dragoon division was Kronick's was struck from his saddle by a blast of canister while urging his soldiers to attack to the last. The Prussians were unable to make any push against the superior Austrian forces in the left flank and in the center. Normally the Prussians had been able to overpower the numbers of their enemy with experienced professional troops and the best cavalry on the battlefield, but with no cavalry advantage in facing well-trained Austrian troops. The situation of the Prussian military was in much worse shape. The Duke of Bevern brought forth the last of the Prussian infantry to launch what was to be the final Prussian effort. The attack went in on the Prussian left. They came under heavy artillery fire, and the 1st Battalion of the Prussian Guard was charged and severely mauled by a Austrian Dragoon division. Bevern's forces pushed into the Austrian line and formed across the ridge. It was at this point that the Netherland Legene Dragoon Regiment led a charge of Austrian cavalry on the rear of the Prussian line, which collapsed. All along the ridge, the exhausted Prussians fell back to the Kaiserstrasse. Holsten's troops fought a vigorous rearguard action in the village of Kranichhorst, and Zayden's hussars withdrew in good order from their position on the left. The conduct of these two officers helped deter the Austrian forces from following up their victory and completely annihilating Frederick's army. Frederick left the battlefield and rode to Nymburk in despair at his defeat. Prince Moritz was left to bring the remains of the army out of the action. The king moved to his old headquarters outside of Prague, where he asked his brother Prince Henry to withdraw the Prussian army from Bohemia. The Prussians lost about 14,000 men, whereas the Austrians only lost around 8,000 men. This was King Frederick's first horrible defeat on the battlefield. The court of Berlin was predictably dejected by the loss. Count Ledendorf was crying, along with many other loyal supporters of Frederick. On the other hand, the reaction in Vienna was one of great jubilation and excitement. Gifts and tidings were bestowed upon the Austrian soldiers who fought bravely in the battle. The Empress Maria Theresa created the Order of Maria Theresa and gave it to Leopold von Daun, the general who led the battle. The Battle of Kolin was no doubt a decisive Austrian victory. In India, at the start of the 7 Years' War, the influence of the ruling Mughal Empire was waning. European powers such as the British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese had all been trading in India for quite some time. The most dominant of these trading companies were the private British East India Company and the state-owned French East India Company. Just like in America, the fighting began in India before the actual war was declared. British Admiral Robert Clive achieved military victory in 1751 with the Siege of Arcot along the southeastern coast of India. Clive and his army proceeded to win several battles along the southern coast of India in the next 2 years which followed, at Trinopoli and Nagapattan. After this victorious campaign, the British proceeded to place Muhammad Ali Khan Ulahari as the provincial Wahhabi leader of the Karnak region. He served as a puppet for British interest in the region. But it was no longer just the Mughal Empire which troubled the British. In the northeastern region of India, in modern-day Bangladesh, the influence of the Bengali Empire was growing. After defeating the Marthas and pushing them out of the region, the king of Bengal, Alvardi Khan, died on April 9th, 1756, and was replaced by his son, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Siraj continues his father's policies of heavy taxation on the local merchants and traders, and he soon became paranoid of British interest in the region. He thought that the British were trying to remove him from power, and he was correct. Siraj and the Bengal army moved to attack the British posts at Calcutta in June 1756. The defenses of Calcutta were weak and negligible. The garrison consisted of only 180 soldiers, 50 European volunteers, 60 European militiamen, and various other volunteers from across Europe, from ships, and was pitted against the Nawab forces of nearly 5,000 infantry and cavalry. The city was occupied on June 16th by Siraj's forces, and the fort surrendered after a brief siege on June 20th. After surrendering the fort, around 146 British soldiers were rounded up and placed in a cell about 14 by 18 square feet. Stanley Wolpert, a prisoner who experienced what would be known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, told of his experience. The dungeon was a strongly barred room, and it was not intended for the confinement of more than 1 or 2 men at a time. There were only 2 windows and a projecting veranda outside, and thick iron bars within impeded the ventilation, while fires raging in different parts of the fort suggested an atmosphere of further oppressiveness. The prisoners were so tightly packed that the door was difficult to close. One of the soldiers stationed in the veranda was offered 1,000 rupees to have them removed to a larger room. He went away, but returned saying it was impossible. The bribe was then doubled, and he made a second attempt with a like result. The Nawab was asleep, and no one dared wake him. By 9 o'clock, several had died, and many more were delirious. A frantic cry for water now became general, and one of the guards, more compassionate than his fellows, called some water to be brought to the bars, where Mr. Howell and 2 or 3 others received it in their hats and passed it on to the men behind. In their impatience to secure it, nearly all was spilled, and the little they drank seemed only to increase their thirst. Self-control was soon lost. Those in the remote parts of the room struggled to reach the window, and a fearful tumult ensued in which the weakest were trampled or pressed to death. They raved, fought, prayed, blasphemed, and many of them fell exhausted on the floor, where suffocation put to an end their torments. About 11 o'clock, the prisoners began to drop off fast. At length, at 6 in the morning, the Siraj-ud-Dowlah awoke and ordered the door to be opened. Of the 146, only 23, including Mr. Howell, remained alive, and they were either stupefied or raving. Fresh air soon revived them, and the commander was then taken before the Nawab, who expressed no regret for what had occurred, and gave no other sign of sympathy than ordering the Englishman a chair and a glass of water. Reports of the treatment of the British soldiers only continued to help bolster the war effort to topple Siraj. Siraj began to negotiate with the French with the hope of getting their support for his rule. Upon hearing the news, the British began to push for Mahtab Rahi, the head of the Jagat Seth Bengal banking family, who was also concerned that Sinaj would seize Seth's huge wealth for his own ends. On June 23, 1757, the attempt for regime change will come to a head at Plassey. Siraj commanded around 50,000 men, including 16,000 cavalry. He also He also had 50 field guns, and officers on loan from the French commanded this artillery. Robert Clive's army was only about 3,000 strong. Clive had 10 field guns and 2 small howitzers. The armies met on the banks of the Bhagirath Hooghly River near a small village of Plassey, about 100 miles north of Calcutta. The Nawab's opening cannonade was out of range, while various skirmishes were inconclusive. A heavy downpour of rain then interrupted the proceedings. The British artillerymen quickly covered their cannon and ammunition with harpoons. The enemy failed to do the same, and their artillery was put out of action. The Bengali men moved forward, assuming that Clive's cannons were also inoperable. They were met by a storm of fire and soon withdraw in disarray. At this point, Mir Jafar, the Sinjah's uncle, commanding the Bengali cavalry, refused to take part, and now turned on his nephew. By the end of the day, Clive's position was to rout the Nawab's disheartened forces, inflicting over 500 casualties with the loss of only 22 men and 50 wounded. Mir Jafar would later betray his nephew and kill Sinjah, and he was appointed Nawab in his place. Though he became little more than a puppet ruler, forced to cede control of Bengal through the treaties he signed with the British. Siraj's defeat also meant that the French were no longer a force in Bengal. Plassey turned out to be a major British victory and would eventually give Britain full control over India. The second article in the Convention of Westminster said that England was required to help Prussia in defending Germany. This was continued with the outbreak of the war between Prussia and Austria. In February 1757, the French army began to build up troops along the Rhine, preparing for an invasion of Hanover. William Pitt began to advocate in Parliament to give King George £2,000 sterling to defend the Hanoverian electorate. Military preparations began, and the Duke of Cumberland, the king's most trusted advisor and the hero of Culloden, was given the assignment to defend the Hanoverian electorate. Or more precisely, as these instructions provided to him on March 30th stated, that he was to keep Hanover from becoming a battleground state and to avoid cooperation with the Prussians if necessary. If French troops were to invade Hanover, Cumberland was advised not to carry resistance to an extreme. These instructions were, of course, provided by the Fox-Newcastle coalition, which did not think the Prussian king stood a chance and wanted to keep British support in the European war to a minimum. But William Pitt's parliamentary coalition wanted to strengthen the Prussian war effort. But the court of Versailles had other plans. Louis XV would dispatch an army under the command of Louis Charles César Letellier d'Etretat to march through Hanover with around 61,000 men, and would meet the Duke of Cumberland at a village called Hastenbeck. Cumberland's total forces numbered around 47,000 men. The two armies finally met on the morning of July 25th at the village of Hastenbeck. The commander of the French right flank, General François de Chevert, was ordered to engage the Hanoverian troops at the village of Wurmberg, but failed to drive them out. As the French left under General Duc de Broglie was still crossing the Weser near Hamel, d'Etretat decided to postpone the battle until all his troops were up. The next day saw the Hanoverian army was holding on a line from Hamelin to Fromberg. It was at this point that the Duke of Cumberland made a grave mistake. He assumed the hill which protected their encampment was impassable. Cumberland's right flank was anchored on the Hamel River and the Hastenbeck Creek. The center of the Hanoverian front was deployed north of the town of Hastenbeck, and an artillery battery was situated on high ground behind the town. The Hanoverian left consisted of 2 entrenched batteries, with grenadier battalions protecting the guns. The left flank was anchored at Obensburg. The French general Chevert was ordered to flank the Hanoverian position with 4 brigades of troops. At 9 a.m., this force advanced on the Obensburg in 3 battalion columns and quickly overwhelmed the Jaeger and Hanoverian battalions. The Duke of Cumberland, seeing his position threatened from the rear, ordered his reserves and the grenadier battalions protecting the guns to recapture Obensburg. The use of these grenadier battalions in the counterattack on Obensburg meant they were no longer available in the center when the main French attack was to be launched by D'Etry. The French main attack consisted of General Desarmes' attack against Fromberg with 5 brigades of infantry, plus 4 regiments of dismounted dragoons. At the same time, the French center assaulted the battery immediately north of it. The Hanoverian Grand Battery was able to repulse several French attacks, but eventually the French attacks overran the guns. When the Hanoverian reserve infantry arrived on the Obensburg, they were able to turn the tide momentarily, but as the Duke of Cumberland began to withdraw his army, they were unable to maintain the now isolated position for very long. The French was to win a decisive victory, losing around 1,300 troops, and the British lost around 1,500 troops. This forced the Duke of Cumberland to move further north in the Hanoverian electorate and gave the French a hold in King George's electorate.